These are the blunders from down thunder that made Australia great.
In 1893, James Patterson, who was a likeable fellow, was elected Premier of the colony of Victoria. Before becoming a politician, he'd been a butcher and a real estate salesman. Unfortunately, his prior work experience didn't equip him for dealing with a financial crisis. Shortly after James became Premier, people started withdrawing their money from the banks. As a result of the government's failure to respond, all of the banks in Victoria collapsed, and the colony was plunged into a depression which lasted many years.
Welcome to this episode of Blunders Down Under, laughable lessons from the past, in which we talk about dumb decisions from the past that have helped make Australia great. I'm Josh McGrath.
And I'm John Gibbs, and today we're talking about James Patterson, the Premier of Victoria, who failed to stop the Great Banking Crisis of 1893.
So who was James Patterson?
James Brown Patterson was born in 1833 in England. He migrated to Victoria in 1852 to seek his fortune as a gold digger, before going into business as a butcher and then selling real estate. He was elected to the Victorian Legislative Assembly in 1870 and served as a politician for a number of years.
How did James become the Premier of Victoria?
In 1891, Victoria suffered a recession after many years of speculation had inflated land prices, and James became the most vocal critic of the government. The government was planning to cut expenditure and raise taxes, but James would have none of it. He wanted lower taxes. In January 1893, he moved a successful motion of no confidence in the government and was himself appointed Premier.
How did the banking crisis start?
In 1891, the Bank of Van Diemen's Land had been forced to close after lending heavily to Tasmanians who had gambled in silver shares. The liquidators discovered that the bank had lent a huge sum to its managing director, and members of the public began to suspect that other banks were also suffering from mismanagement, incompetence and corruption. In 1892, the Bank of South Australia was forced to close, followed by the New Oriental Bank and the Federal Bank. However, these were only small banks, and so far there was no threat to the 12 largest banks in Australia.
And what happened next?
The Commercial Bank of Australia was the first big bank to come under suspicion. It had lent heavily to people who had speculated in property during the land boom. Just before Easter 1893, large numbers of people could be seen entering and leaving the bank's head office in Melbourne. Customers joined the queues to withdraw their money in gold, and by 5th April, the bank was running out of gold and suspended payments.
What happened after the first big bank failed?
This led to contagion in the banking system. The English, Scottish and Australian Chartered Bank was next to close when too many people wanted to withdraw their deposits at the same time. 5 banks closed during April 1893 when depositors withdrew their deposits in gold faster than the banks could find the gold required to pay them.
What strategy did Patterson use in responding to this crisis?
James Patterson and his treasurer, Godfrey Carter, had no idea how to respond. Godfrey's previous commercial experience as a wine merchant was of no assistance in dealing with the colony's financial crisis. James and Godfrey took a train down to Frankston on the 30th of April to visit the governor's holiday house and get him to sign a proclamation closing all banks for a week in an attempt to stop the run on the banks.
And how successful was this 1-week close?
Unfortunately, all that the proclamation did was to announce to the world that Victoria had a banking crisis. James and Godfrey didn't have any plan for what happened after the week-long bank holiday. Angry crowds gathered outside banks, and even more people wanted to withdraw funds when the banks reopened. During May 1893, 9 more banks closed their doors.
And how were the people of Victoria affected by this banking crisis?
By June, the majority of people in Victoria no longer had access to any banking services. Payments were not being made. Business transactions could not be completed. Employers couldn't pay their employees' wages. Thousands of people lost their jobs. The Anglican Bishop of Melbourne led a day of humiliation and prayer.
What actions did the Premier of New South Wales take against this bank crisis?
The Premier of New South Wales was George Dibbs. He'd previously run a business which was ruined by the failure of a bank, and he'd spent time in prison after refusing to pay damages in a dubious defamation case, so he knew how to deal with hard times. When customers queued up at a New South Wales bank to withdraw their money, he stood in the doorway, urging them to go home, and he wrote a notice in his own handwriting promising that his government would guarantee all deposits. His government then passed an act making banknotes issued by the bank's legal tender so that people could use them without needing to convert their money into legal tender.
And what was the outcome of those actions?
Some of the banks operating in New South Wales still failed because they didn't take advantage of their new power to issue paper money, but other banks survived, largely due to George Dibbs's confident leadership and sound policies. If the Victorian government had adopted similar sensible practices, much of the harm which occurred in Victoria could have been avoided.
Well, how did the banking crisis end?
As it turned out, nearly everyone got their money back in the end. Each bank went through a reconstruction process and reopened within a few months of closing. However, the loss of confidence in the banking system was more permanent, and the bank failures had turned an economic recession into a depression, which was deeper and longer lasting than the Great Depression of the 1930s.
What happened to James Patterson's government?
James Patterson's government in Victoria floundered along for another year until August 1894, when he was thrown out by a vote of no confidence in the Legislative Assembly. He was replaced by George Turner, a lawyer, who cut expenditures and increased taxes to balance the budget. The expenditure cuts made the Depression worse by increasing unemployment, but after the incompetence of James Patterson's government, George Turner was regarded as prudent and dependable.
Well, what happened to James later in life?
James stayed on in the Legislative Assembly as a member of the opposition, but he died the following year from influenza. The suburb of Patterson Lakes is thought to be named after him.
And what's the moral of this story?
If you choose leaders who don't have the skills and experience necessary to do their jobs properly, you're likely to experience bad outcomes, particularly in times of crisis, and inappropriate government policies and actions may cause wholesale financial devastation.